Hi everyone. This is a quick introduction, or hopefully as quick as I can make it, of the rhetorical analysis essay. Just a review of some of the major ideas. I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly, but I want to remind everyone, if there's anything that's confusing at all to you, if I say something quickly and you don't get it, or you're a little confused, please feel free to email me and I'll be happy to clear anything up. So as you know, the rhetorical analysis essay is increasingly popular over the last 10 years in terms of standardized testing. It used to be that it was only on the AP language exam. Now, as you know, it is also the essay for the SAT. And with rhetoric, we are talking about, as Aristotle said, the art of persuasion. How do we make an argument to get somebody to change their mind? Rhetorical analysis is explaining, here's why this argument works. So we're not agreeing or disagreeing with the speaker or the writer. We're not saying our opinion as whether they're right or wrong. We are saying, here's what this person does to make their argument more effective. And three of the big things to think about here, the most essential is Aristotle's rhetorical triangle of speaker, audience, and subject. Who is talking or writing? What are they trying to say? And who is it aimed at? Some other big building blocks here. And we're not going to go through every single slide on this, but I want to, again, hit the major points of review. Logos, pathos, and ethos should be familiar to us. We started talking about those freshman year. You reviewed them sophomore year. In junior year, you should be covering this rhetorical analysis as well to get ready for the SAT. And again, senior year, in particular, AP Lang focuses on this. So I want to say this very clearly. Do not make logos, pathos, and ethos your thesis statement. Again, do not make logos, pathos, and ethos your thesis statement. This is a way to start thinking about rhetorical analysis. This is not the end point where you want your thesis to be. This is where we start thinking, okay, we read through the article or the excerpt once. Now we need to figure out what sort of things are going to be in our thesis. This is where we start that thinking. It's not where we want to end up. We don't want to say, well, the author uses pathos. It's too vague. We want to be more specific. What emotion are they trying to provoke in the audience? What are they doing to make the audience feel that emotion? That's where we want to eventually get to. Again, this should be familiar, but very briefly. Logos is a logical appeal, where you want someone to think and change their mind. Pathos is an emotional appeal, where you want someone to feel something, either positive or negative, and change their mind. Ethos is more about the presentation. Who is talking? Why would I be more likely to believe this person? And then also, how do they present themselves? Ethos, to be clear, is not ethics. That's one way of making an ethos argument, is to sort of appeal to the fact that well, we share a similar morality in terms of, well, that's more likely why I would believe this person. But it is not just ethics. It's about credibility and why you believe this person. And so for one example, why would you have no homework over Christmas break? A logos logical appeal would say, a recent study has shown that students score 8% higher on their midterms when they have a full 2 weeks off for Christmas break with no homework. Because that's sort of logical, right? Maybe you get more of a chance to rest and recharge. Even if you didn't have the specific statistic there, the common sense aspect of, well, think about it. Doesn't it make sense if we get more of a rest, more time to recharge, students would come back and do better? Sure. You could also make a pathos appeal there, either positive or negative. You know, Mr. Kelly, Christmas is a time for family. It's a time for love and for gathering, for family, swapping gifts and having dinner and all these wonderful things. And you use this elevated language and maybe even use imagery to make people see things, or sensory language to make them feel like they're there. Or it's a negative thing. And, you're sort of trying to make someone feel guilty. Like, well, Mr. Kelly, I thought Christmas was about Jesus. are you saying that homework is more important? So whether it's positive or negative, if you want to feel something, it's a pathos appeal. And then lastly, we kind of talked about this, but ethos is about who is the speaker? Why are we likely to listen to this person? It could either be because of something that the speaker has done before that gives them experience or credibility in a field, or authority is another word for credibility here. Or it could also just be, how does someone present themselves in the moment? Are you more likely to listen to someone who is very self-centered and arrogant, or someone who's very humble and unassuming? Usually you'd be the second one, but it sort of depends on the audience and the context there, right? And so ethos is who's talking, why should we listen to them, and how do they present themselves? And again, this should not be your thesis statement, and every author does not use every single appeal in every text here as well. You may see some that even blend two together. Like if we said that researchers from MIT have shown that students' second semester grades are 17% higher with a no homework over Christmas break. Well, that's sort of combining logos and ethos. On the one hand, we have a statistic that makes an argument. On the other hand, we have a credible institution here. MIT is pretty good at math. And so that would be sort of a combination of the two. We also have soapstone as a way to, again, start thinking rhetorically. This stuff may not be in your body paragraphs, but you might see soapstone show up and check off a few of these in your introduction. The introduction is really the only place where we do any kind of summary about what is the author saying. By the time we get to the body paragraphs, we want to be explaining, okay, well, why, what are the specific strategies? The introduction is where maybe we take a bigger, wider look at things. Who is talking? Why does this person have credibility? What is the occasion here? The context matters. If you have someone writing about race relations in the United States, that's really going to matter whether we're talking about the 1820s or the 1920s or the 2020s. You don't need to be a history expert here, but it is really important to listen to, to read that introductory paragraph, that blurb, to understand what is the context, what are the things happening around the text. And then by kairos there, that's an ancient Greek word that means really the moment that requires a speaker. Like, what is happening that our author feels like, well, I have to say something here. And so that would be our occasion. The audience is probably an easy one, but it's also a really important one. Just think about who is being addressed. What is their relationship to the speaker? What arguments are sort of tailored for them? If you have a politician who is going out on the campaign trail, they're going to talk about different issues depending on the audience, right? Senior citizens in nursing homes have different concerns, usually, than a bunch of college kids on a college campus. And they both might have different concerns than, say, parents, middle-aged people, of which I am not one, just to be clear. But so it depends on, well, who are you talking to? Sometimes the message is specifically aimed at the audience. Purpose. Purpose is one of the most important things here, but it's something that should be in your thesis statement because it's what is the author trying to do? Our thesis statements in general should look like author, the speaker is trying to achieve their purpose by 1, 2, 3. George Washington is trying to motivate his troops by using imagery of victory to inspire them and giving them real-life examples so they can make the logical connection to how this will affect their future, or something like that. Subject is simply what is the message, and then tone is what's the mood or the atmosphere. Is the speaker very casual, funny, informal? Are they very serious? Why does that work? Why does that make what they're saying more effective? This is all messed up because of the slide. That's okay. We're going to skip that one. Similar to Soapstone, the new one here is Space Cat that the College Board is talking about. And so here, what is different? A lot of it is the same, but it gets us to think about choices, appeals, and exigence would be the new ones here. Exigence is really what is, again, so we talked about that idea of kairos. Why is a speaker required here? The choices, we can look at what specific choices did the speaker or the author make when putting their argument together. And the appeals we just sort of discussed there as well. So whichever acronym you want to use, they're both pointing you in a very similar direction, which is to think about how is the author specifically presenting their argument. This is less applicable for just the essay, so we're going to skip some of these picture things. But again, rhetorical analysis with pictures, a picture can make an argument as well here, and it can still be analyzed. So one example here, the vacuum cleaner one. This picture is still making an argument. We're using the same tools here that we would with a rhetorical analysis essay prompt. In this case, we can see, these first two guys here are very serious, and naturally we sort of look at them first. We get the setup. We've got these very serious looking guys and hunting. And then we have this last guy there who, instead of bringing a gun, brought his vacuum cleaner. And again, what is the argument here? The vacuum cleaner is so strong that it can just pull this duck down from the sky. And this guy looks very pleased with himself. The duck looks very surprised. And so again, you're not going to get anything like this, of course, for your essay, but we use these skills of rhetorical analysis all the time. Anytime we get a text message that we have to analyze and figure, okay, well, what did they mean when they said this? We think about, all right, who's the speaker? What's the context? What's the relationship there? And we break it down. Let's talk about some important terms to know. One of them is alliteration, the repetition of that same sound for emphasis. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. If you'd like, you can pause, you can write this down yourself if you want to, but mostly, again, I would, if you want to pause in between these, feel free. Again, if there's anything you're not sure of, feel free to send me an email. We can also talk about the use of allusions, a reference to a person, event, place, or a work of art. Really, a reference to anything. A couple of students in the past have used the phrase like name dropping in a formal essay. The better way to say that would be that the speaker makes an allusion to or a reference to X, Y, or Z. Soapstone, we're not going to go over these things again, but and just for the record, when we're looking at these different terms here, these are the things that could be your body paragraph, right? And I'm not going to review all these, but you could have a whole body paragraph about the audience that they're aiming at, the tone that they're using necessarily. So we talked about a lot of the ideas here, but we should point out that they're still applicable here. Concession and refutation is a good one to keep in mind. Concession is when we acknowledge, hey, the opposing argument could be true or reasonable. They have a point. Why does this work? It makes us seem like we are more reasonable, like we're not crazy people. To point out, yeah, you know what? My opponent does have a good point. this is right, but, and then here comes the refutation part, here's where they're wrong. And so by acknowledging the positive aspects, to just totally reject an argument and say like, oh, well, this is garbage, it's trash, there's nothing good about it, can potentially alienate people. But to acknowledge part of something, or even to acknowledge that like, well, your purpose is a good one, but here's why you're going the wrong way to achieve it, can show the speaker to be more reasonable. And then the refutation would be, but here's why you're wrong, right? Like, you have some good points, and I agree with you here, there's some common ground, but, and then here's the refutation as to why this other argument is wrong. My example that I'm using down here on the bottom is, so when I was a junior in high school, it was 2003, and we were still pretty close to 9/11, and there was a war that was going on at the time as well in the Middle East. And so I had to sort of talk my parents into, well, here's why I should still be able to go to the school trip to Italy. And so, again, concession. My parents were right to be worried. I'm glad you're worried. That shows that you care, and I'm glad you're trying to protect me. But here's why I should still be able to go. And that it shows that you're still seeing reality, right? That you can see something good here. And when someone is acknowledged, it tends to win them over a little bit more as well. So the counter argument would really be often the refutation there, right? And here's where we look at so the counter argument would be whatever is against my argument. And so a lot of Thomas Aquinas is probably the best example of this, but an argument is so much more effective when it anticipates what people could say against it, right? I want everybody to read this book for homework this week. And I know that you might say, like, well, I can't read a whole book in a week, but this is a very short one. It is only 100 pages. And you might say, well, it's really hard. I don't know if I can do that. But this was written in 2014. The language is very modern. It's going to fly. So I'm anticipating, well, what could people say against my argument? And you're trying to deal with that in advance. One other point. If we're going to just going back to it, if we're going to make a concession and refutation, better to do that in the introduction than in the conclusion. If we're going to acknowledge that the other side has a point, let's do it early, and then you move on in your introduction to your thesis, which is your argument. It is much more effective to acknowledge that at the beginning and then have your main argument than to make your main argument and then at the end be like, and oh, by the way, the other side has good points too. And so the counter argument goes along with that. Sometimes maybe in the introduction we look at, okay, well, what could be the arguments against here if we were writing our own argument? In a rhetorical analysis essay, we're looking for how is the author using these things, right? And so in the concession and refutation, we might look and say, well, they're acknowledging the opposing point here. They're going to win people over by doing that, or they're going to show that they're more reasonable. We might say, well, they're anticipating the counter-arguments. By dealing with them in advance, they're making their own argument seem much stronger. Diction is one of, I would say, the big four. The things that show up the most often. If you could only pick 4 things to always have to write about, no matter what the prompt is, I would say they would probably be diction, syntax, imagery, and figurative language. Diction is probably maybe the most applicable one to everything, because what diction is why does the author use these particular words. Everything that you've ever read or heard could have been phrased slightly different, right? But why does the author choose these specific words? The example here is from Macbeth. As we have I'm not going to try to spoil the whole thing in case anyone hasn't read it yet. But we have a character who has died, and another character is sort of reflecting on this. You know, even the first line, she should have died hereafter. Hereafter, you know, is a word that is often used to describe, you know, the next life. It's evocative compared to just saying, well, she should have kicked the bucket later, right? It's saying the exact same thing, but it's very different. Later on, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. In addition to also being used in Hamilton, you might recognize the tomorrow and tomorrow lines. We also see it, well, why a dusty death there? Why later on does Shakespeare say, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage? Why struts instead of walks? And so we think about, why is the author or the speaker using these particular words? Are they fancy words, or are they big, you know, SAT style words here that are going to make their argument seem impressive? Are they more casual, or is it slang? Why use these particular words? And ultimately what we're looking for here when we explain why do they work is we think about, what is the impact on the audience? We explain, well, here's why this works to persuade the audience. The next thing we can look at here is syntax. And syntax is another really important one. Whereas diction is looking at the specific words that are used, syntax is more about the structure and organization of those words. So it's not about the word choice, it's about how the words and sentences and paragraphs are built. Do we have a very long, rambling sentence that makes a point by being long and rambling? Do we have short sentences that are used for emphasis at the end or at the beginning of a sentence? Do we have rhetorical questions that get people thinking on a particular track and then deal with the subject matter at hand? And so again, syntax, we're looking here less about not just the word choice, the vocabulary, but how is this speech or article built? Long sentences, short sentences, paragraphs length. You could even look at here the structure of the argument, right? Does a sentence start in a particular way or end in a particular way? Imagery is another one that, if I could only pick two, like if I knew going into either the AP Lang exam or the SAT essay, and they said, you can't even look at the passage, you got to pick two things for your body paragraphs to write about, I would probably pick diction and imagery. Now, obviously, every passage or prompt is different, and you should read to see what's there and then decide what to write about. However, it's good to know that this is one of the most common ones because it's so universal. Imagery is any kind of sensory language. Obviously, the most common one is sight, hence imagery. When the author describes things so we can see them. But this also applies to the other senses as well. And so anytime we have an author using sensory language, imagery is a great thing to talk about here. Now, that being said, remember that in our body paragraph, we can't just say, and this is important, we can't just say, hey, here's imagery. It is not rhetorical identification. It is rhetorical analysis. We have to explain, here's why this works. Here's why this persuades the audience. So we don't just say, well, the author uses imagery. Maybe we say something like, the author uses this particular imagery to make people feel this emotion. The author describes the experience of walking alone on the Appalachian Trail to try to make people feel that connection with nature. The sounds, the sights, you know, the sunlight going, shining through green leaves, the crunch of footsteps on leaves, or hearing birds, to bring you into the moment. Or maybe it's like the beach that they're trying to, and why? Okay, so what does the author want you to feel there? Why does it work? Again, it's not just rhetorical identification where we say, oh, we found this thing. We have to explain why. Juxtaposition is when the author is contrasting two things, holding them up to accentuate the differences. So if you're looking for the authors comparing, contrasting two things, the fancy word for that there is juxtaposition. Persona is actually kind of a rare one, but if it does show up, it can be a really effective thing to talk about. But essentially, a persona is a mask, a character that someone is putting on here. Is a speaker presenting themselves in a certain way in terms of playing a role? Not going to apply to everything, but worth keeping in mind for when it does. Parallelism is something that I think people are very familiar with. For example here, Kennedy said, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty." The phrasing, the way that it's structured in this parallel way, pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, emphasizes the resolve that Kennedy is trying to show from the country. If he had phrased that differently, we shall pay any price, any burden will be borne. Meeting any hardship is something we can do. We will plan to support any friend, and those who will be our foes will be opposed. Like, you get lost in the rambling, but when you can narrow it down to just have that repetition, it emphasizes the idea. Now, we can't stop there. We can't just say Kennedy uses parallelism for emphasis. We have to explain, why is this particular idea important that it's emphasized? Why is that going to persuade the audience? Another great example here from George W. Bush in the aftermath of 9/11. We've seen the unfurling of flags, the lighting of candles, the giving of blood, the saying of prayers in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. Unfurling of flags, lighting of candles, giving of blood, saying of prayers, all of those things in parallel hit harder than if they were rephrased. So why is that idea so important? That's what we would then explain in our body paragraph. Metaphor and simile, there's a lot of good videos out there. You've been doing this since 5th grade. But it's worth noting that people consistently miss these in rhetorical analysis passages. Always keep an eye out for metaphor and similes, figurative language. Personification is when we have giving human qualities to any sort of thing that is not human, whether it's an object or an abstract idea. Why would something be personified. If we're talking about the country as, if we're talking, for example, the United States is currently struggling under the burden of this pandemic that is sweeping the world. It is weighing down the shoulders of the country. Well, that is we're talking about the country there as if it is a human being. Anytime we use personification, again, we don't just say, hey, there's personification. We talk about, why does it matter? Why is this argument effective? Repetition, we already kind of talked about with parallelism. I know this is getting long, so I'm going to wrap it up. But if we have a word that is repeated or a phrase that is repeated, especially at the start of a sentence, then repetition can be effective. Last couple notes. Reminders that I would go over here. For your introduction for rhetorical analysis, remember, we're looking at soapstone stuff. We end with a specific thesis. The speaker makes this argument effectively makes this argument by, and we talk about usually 3 strategies that the author is using. In our body paragraphs, we are going to use direct quotes. Direct quotes, not necessarily an entire sentence. We don't need to quote an entire sentence. We just want to quote the part that we're going to talk about. But if we can have 2 or 3 quotes, even if some of them we have less to say about than the primary one. If we're talking about imagery, let's pull out a quote on imagery and then take a few sentences to explain, here's why this persuades the audience. Then we find another couple examples and we talk about, here's why this works. So each body paragraph should have 2 or 3 quotes that we then use to explain, here's why this persuades the audience. And your conclusion, if you're writing this in a timed one, your conclusion may not be huge. What I would say is that you do not need to repeat your thesis. What I would recommend doing is looking at, why does this matter? Look at the big picture again. What is our author trying to achieve? Why is he successful? Why is it important that he is successful? Maybe, or she. Maybe this goes back to purpose. And we wrap things up in our conclusion. But I'm expecting that to be a little more rushed for everybody. You want to make sure that you have a good introduction, good thesis, and really work on the body paragraphs. I would rather have 3 great body paragraphs and a 30-second conclusion than to rush your analysis and your body paragraphs and then, have all this time for a conclusion. But yeah, the other thing we can do in the conclusion is look at, well, how does the author end their argument? Sometimes we can look at, okay, well, here's how they wrap things up as a way to also do that ourselves. If anyone has any questions on any of this stuff or they want to talk about it, always feel free to send me an email. But I hope this has been a good review of some of the basic thinking for rhetorical analysis and then some of the specific rhetorical devices or strategies that we can see an author using. But last thing, I promise this is the last thing. Remember that you do not need to talk about these things that I just mentioned necessarily. They're good starting points. I wouldn't have just spent all this time doing it if they didn't matter at all. But let's say you see the author do something in their argument that really persuades people. That strategy is something that you can talk about in a body paragraph. It doesn't have to be something that you have a fancy name or rhetorical device for. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Good luck.